Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we are actually in our final talk of the series on the Life in the Balance series. And today we'll be discussing communication. Because as we've gone through, we talked about how a lot of boundaries and a lot of things we're dealing with are core values, are communicating our identity and those types of things. And so, however, when it comes to communication, we can often fumble through it a bit, and a lot of times I think we tend to overestimate our ability to communicate. So for me, that manifested itself one time in a lesson from a bad haircut. So I lived in Slovakia for 3 years and traveled around and had long hair at that point. And I had a friend that said, "You've never really lived somewhere until you got a haircut there," which has proved to be very true. Very, very true. So I went in and I said, we were about to do this scavenger hunt thing, and so I was like, okay, well, I just want to trim, and I actually wanted him to dye it blonde, which is funny. So I was like, so just give me a trim and dye it blonde, and they're like, okay. Well, within the first 5 seconds, I could tell this is going nowhere that I want it to, because from right at the beginning, like they pull out their bangs and pulled up my bangs, and then with the straight razor just go, and I was like, okay. So then you're just paying for the story at this point, and it just went. So I proceeded to get the most incredible European mullet you have ever seen, and it was crazy looking. I mean, spit curls on the side, like it was incredible. So. Some of that, no. But it was so bad. So I was dating Brooks at the time, and I called her and I was like, I just got the worst haircut of my life. And she was like, "You're kidding." And I was like, "No, meet me at this subway station." So we come in, she didn't even recognize me. And then she get in and she's like, "Oh my gosh." I was like, "Told you, I wasn't lying. Like this is real bad. So what is overconfidence? A lot of times when we're communicating, we can be overconfident. And there's a couple reasons for that we'll explore here in a bit. Another one is expectations, like what we think, how we think the message will be received, our ability to communicate, what we expect people to already know, and those kind of things, they can all add to that. So, and breaking it down a little bit further, in communication, one of the things we're trying to do is get what is in our heart and really with our faith, what God has called us to take that from an internal position to be able to then voice that externally. And so there can be some things that they get convoluted. A lot of times too, it's because these are not things that they're not light switch decisions. They're things that maybe have been years in the making. There are things that a lot of thought have gone into. Sometimes when I sit on panels now, specifically in our culture, and people will ask me a question, sometimes I defer not to answer. And the reason isn't because I don't know what I want to say, it's just that it's not the right context for me to be able to explain what I want to say. You want me to give an answer that you can then turn around and tweet out to somebody, but I can't explain this in 180 characters or whatever. Like this has been years in the making, and it merits a conversation, not just a statement. But we want statements. We just want quick statements, something you can tweet, something you can get out, make it to a meme and put out somewhere so people get it. And that can't happen. That's not realistic for us to be able to do, because it's our identity. It's worth more than that, so to speak. So it deserves the time. False assumptions, and this kind of got me a lot. I always assumed everybody thinks the same way I do, which is also funny because I'm a very creative person. I've realized there's rarely anybody that thinks the same way I do. But I've seen that we all kind of think that. Like we all are coming to the table thinking like, oh yeah, well they would understand that. And realistically, no, they don't. And so sometimes we can falsely assume that we're going to be on the same page going into a conversation when that's not true. Another thing that plays into it, and this can be because of culture, experience, and other things, but the vocabulary will differ when we're communicating a heart value or an identity. Some things that you may say may be a trigger for somebody else on the other end, and different things with that. Sometimes, this is a little tangent here to insert this, but sometimes if you hit a trigger with somebody, how do you know when you hit a trigger? And I would say it's when the emotional response is not, is disproportionate to what has happened. So all of a sudden you're greatly offended by this one thing I said, and it's probably because I hit a trigger with you for something. There's something behind that. The emotional response doesn't, necessitate this much of a reaction. So it's something to be aware of when you're dealing with different things that there could be trauma behind it or things like that. So understanding sometimes when we say things, we're assuming that they're thinking the same way, but you actually may say a trigger and it triggers this thing. It's like, okay, this is not at all what I meant by that kind of thing. And so we can stumble over our vocabulary with it as well. Our expressions, this played into a lot living overseas, and we would say things and you're like, I have no idea what that means or what you mean by that specifically, because I can't put that in this context and I can't understand where you're coming from in that. And so sometimes if I'm trying to communicate my identity and I rely too much on certain things, it can get really frustrating because I'm communicating my identity, but you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. And I'm trying to defer back to this expression I think sums it up, and you're still not getting it. And so it can still get really convoluted in it. And then body language. Sometimes the way we hold ourselves, the way, just to be aware of, there's whole courses and majors on this now, on communication, but how your body language communicates with that. How are you presenting yourself as you talk about these things? And intensity and intentions. I think some of this, it depends on how well you know the people you're talking to and trying to communicate with. Whereas some personalities are stronger, and so it will come across intense. Whereas, it's like, oh, well, that's really he's just a loud talker, or something like that. Or intentions, if I don't know you and you're coming in with this, I may wonder what you're trying to really get at and kind of dig into a little bit. So communication can be very tricky in trying to work through. There's a great example of this in Daniel, specifically in Daniel chapter 1. And what you have, we talked about that, referenced him earlier in the series. And what you have with Daniel is he's been taken into captivity. And he has been put through this system of re-education. His name has been changed. And there's been all these different things he's been asked to do, asked to participate in. But Daniel draws the line when he says, I won't eat this food. And we had different talks on why that may be with that. But he draws this line of why he won't eat this food. But it's interesting to see what he does it, because in there you see that him drawing this line could actually cause friction. So it's important to know who's in the story. So the participants, we have Daniel, who you primarily hear talking, and then you also have this guy named Ashpenaz. So who Ashpenaz is, it's an awesome name, but who Ashpenaz is he's basically the king's chief overseer advisor. So he's the guy kind of running it. So when Daniel presents his boundary line to Ashpenaz, Ashpenaz's counter is, what will the king think of me? Like, I'm not doing my job if you're not doing this. Like, we could offend the king in doing this kind of thing. So he draws this boundary line of what they would do and what they wouldn't do. He communicated this clearly. He didn't say, we're not eating at all. He didn't say, we're not eating your food because it's terrible. But instead, he said, here's what we will eat. Here's what we are willing to do. And he kind of framed it for him of what they could do and then also what they wouldn't do. He didn't just come in and say, we're not doing anything. I think it also merits to see that Daniel did do some things Like, he did let them change his name. He did go to their school. He did do certain things with that, but this is the boundary line that he felt like God was calling him to make. And so he communicated in that boundary line, here's kind of where it is. You don't really know how much, kind of his motivation is that he wouldn't defile himself, is what it says. You don't necessarily know exactly how he communicated that to them, but he did do it respectfully and say, this is what I can do. I can do the vegetables and water pieces. I'm not going to do this other part with it. But one of the things that's interesting is Daniel addresses the risk to Ashpenaz. Because Ashpenaz says, like, what will the king think of me if you do this? And so what Daniel actually does is he sees the risk and he creates an option. In the option, he says, test us for 10 days. And if you test us for 10 days and we come back lacking, then you're not at fault. So he basically gives Ashpenaz an out. I realize this could put you in a weird position with the king, but I'm willing to take the blame for what may happen. And so you have an out. You can put it on me, kind of thing. I think that shows tremendous sensitivity. Also that Daniel didn't feel entitled, that Ashpenaz should take blame for his decisions, his faith in this scenario. And so I think there's a lot to be said, because at times we come into these scenarios and situations where God may call us to draw boundary lines, and we'll explore this a little bit more, but how can we be considerate? Like, what all is put? Is there a risk that comes not only to us but to others in the drawing of this boundary line? And then the creation of an out. And in that, it's the competition that he says, test us after 10 days and let us see. So in communicating boundaries, one of the things that is incredibly important is a mature awareness. Not to get so self-involved that you're not aware of what you're asking, what it may cause the people on the other side. So being aware of that and saying, like, in the situation that you're having to deal with where you're drawing this boundary line, how will it affect them? How does it affect you, benefit you, may hinder you, but also how does it affect them, and then maybe even further out, the organization, and thinking through those pieces. But then also giving grace, and this is a huge one. We need to give grace to ourselves, because, like I said, we're communicating core identities and core values, and you may stumble over doing this a little bit, and it may not be able to happen in one conversation, but it may be a series of conversations. And I need to give myself grace. I also need to give grace to other people. And some of that is because we are communicating these core boundaries, these core values in our identity, you're presenting some big things to people at time. And so it would not be logical for you to expect an immediate response a lot of times. Because you've sat on this conversation probably for a while, and you formed it in your head. So we can't go in and automatically expect an immediate answer. So you need to give grace, just like you're wanting grace for them and understanding the boundary you're lying, you need to give them grace to process what you're asking for. And so ask for a follow-up meeting to go through a little bit more with that. But then also have the element of faith in stepping out to have this conversation. So with Daniel, again, talking to Ashpenaz, it's like he's a captive. It's like he could get thrown in prison, he could do all this other stuff. But yet, he took this step of faith. God is calling us to step out. And we'll see this again play out a lot more in another example. One of the things that's incredibly valuable that we often do not take advantage of is how God has given us community and the importance of community in our communication. Some of that is because God can provide editors and interpreters. my wife. For a while, I would write an email, and she was just like, let me just read it before you send it. It's like, hold on a second. And she would edit saying, like, I wouldn't say it that way. That may come across that way, like those kind of things. But also interpreters, cultural interpreters, background interpreters, like, hey, how can this come through? How can this come across? And the coming down, helping people letting people help you craft what God is trying to express, what you're trying to express out of your heart with your identity. And it's such a, like I said, these are such valuable concepts and valuable pieces that it would be wise for us to take advantage of community and what God is calling us to do with that. Asking for help, big thing that we often struggle with. Some of that is because of pride. I think I should be able to do it. I think I can do it myself. I don't need this. Some of that, or pride because maybe I'm not mature enough to have this conversation, or I've never had one before, but I feel like everybody expects me to know what to do. And so we just kind of push through it and fumble through it when we could ask for help for other people that have gone before us and done it as well. Doing that requires vulnerability to admit that we're in process. That I don't expect you to be perfect, and don't expect me to be perfect. And vulnerable because this is what I'm struggling with. This is what I'm going to have to ask for help with. This is the boundary line I'm drawing. This may be why, and those kind of elements. But if we don't seek help, we run a greater risk of miscommunication. If you're the only one listening to the conversation in your head, there's a greater risk that it will get miscommunicated as it comes out. And so you can help refine it as it gets presented. And again, faith. You see this a lot, and we'll talk about this in a minute with Esther. Esther had to go before the king and communicate on behalf of the Jewish people so that they didn't get slaughtered. But what she told her uncle Mordecai and the people around her was, pray for me while I go do this. And that is the same thing God calls us to do. Hey, I'm about to go in and have this hard conversation with my work about this. I need you all praying for me from 10:30 to 11:45. And that needs to happen. And that is what God has called us to. I think we can feel so individualized in like the university setting and different departments. And it's like, I like you, but I don't see you because I'm on the other side. But how does God want us as believers to function as a community here? And how can we help each other out, like we talked about in Hebrews, encouraging one another daily? How can we pray on behalf of each other as we go forward? What is God calling us to do? And how can we have faith together and step out? So have others join us and have others support you as well too. Like, even as you're expressing your boundary line, somebody else may be like, hey, actually, I would like to step with you with this, and like us go before this, not just you go before this kind of thing, and do that. Expectations and what happens next. No immediate response. Like, don't expect an immediate response. Specifically, sometimes if you do, you try to force it, people will feel trapped. And so address it a lot of times too. Like if I'm having deep conversation with somebody, or I present something that I know is causing them a risk or asking a lot of them, I will also offer an out and say, I know this is a lot. Could we get together next week and talk about it again, or whenever you're ready, kind of thing. Just to let them know and be respectful of that. And give them time to process. Like I said, just like you put all this work in before the conversation, internally talking with people, they're going to have to think and take a lot of time to process through it. With what happened, model what you're asking for. You're asking for grace and patience, and you need to model that to them, of grace and patience. I realize nobody may have ever asked for this before. I realize this is different than what everybody else is doing. But this is what I feel like God's doing. Offer to explain. I have nothing to hide here. And having a clear conscience when it is. Like, if you want to know more, I can explain more of why I can't do this thing. You know, we shouldn't have anything to hide, really. What effect does what I'm asking for, how does that play itself out? Does it shift their boundaries and what they're getting asked to do? So will they not be viewed as not as profitable or something like that? Like, how is it maybe causing a risk there or asking them to do something? And does it present a risk? So what I ask could be like, okay, that means some people may have to work more hours or their work schedules change. Does this present a risk of maybe the evaluation of their performance kind of thing? Because even in these side conversations that we've had among things, like, well, if I say that I'm not comfortable doing something, that's another job somebody else has to pick up. So then what can I do? And it's like, that's when I think you offer and communicate, I'm willing to do these other things. This is what I can't do and I don't really want to do. This is what I can't do. And so let's talk this out and see how can we work through this. Dealing with no. Sometimes no matter how great you do it, it comes back no. And there's different two main scenarios. One is if it is a no that does not compromise your faith or what God has put in there, then I need to respect authority. When my faith isn't compromised, I may not like it, but something to do. So just passages to kind of look without where God calls us to respect those in authority over us. Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, Hebrews 13:7. Respect all those that God has put into authority over us. I may not like it, but how can I respectfully do it? And when my faith is not compromised in that. And then there's what I would call righteous dissent, where my faith is compromised. I feel like this goes against what God has called me to do. And so it's really fleshing that out. This is where community calls becomes increasingly important. How is your faith being compromised? What is it that is being asked that you feel like you cannot cross? Talk that through. And then taking a step of faith. And kind of the best example of that is Esther and Daniel. And so in these two scenarios, Esther went against a cultural no. So I would say there's kind of two. There's a cultural no, and then with Daniel, it was a legal no. The cultural no that Esther had is nobody was supposed to go before the king unless they were summoned. And what would happen is, and why I say it wasn't a legal no, is because if the king wanted to see you, you were fine. If it was a legal no, everybody would just be dead if they broke the rule. But there was a cultural kind of thing of like, nah, I'm okay, you can come on in. But specifically for women and in these things, Esther was really crossing the cultural bounds. At the time that it was happening, when she was getting asked to do in front of everybody, she went against the main cultural no at the time of, no, you don't go talk to the king about this type of thing at this time. But she was like, no, God has called me to do this on behalf of my people. And she had her uncles praying with her. So she followed God's call and had the community behind her to go with. And so, as you see in the story of Esther, the king responds well. The people of Israel are spared from that. In Daniel went against the legal no. So this is interesting to see how this scenario came about. This is Daniel in the lion's den. And so there's actually been a regime kind of switch, and there's a new king. But the king loved Daniel. King Darius loves Daniel and really likes what he does. You can tell by his work, Daniel is very good. And actually, it is because of his work that his coworkers are mad because they've been skimming off the top and kind of cutting corners, but now they're getting basically brought to light because Daniel's being on point all the time and those kind of things. And so they devised this thing. They knew Daniel was religious and that he prayed, so they convinced Darius to make a decree that you can only pray to him. Darius didn't know that Daniel was faithful in that. So he passes this law, Daniel doesn't dissent in that he goes in the public square and starts praying. He's doing it in his home, privately, but he's set up. And these guys come in and bust him. And so he went against the legal no, not compromising his faith and what God was calling him to do. One of the things that's really important to see here, Daniel was not spared the consequences. A lot of times we think that if we go before and have this communicate that we will be spared of the consequences, and we're not guaranteed that. Daniel was literally thrown in the lion's den. At what point did Daniel know he wouldn't get eaten? I don't know. You know, like I doubt like they all threw him in the lion's den. The lions are all like, hey, you know, like come on, Snail. Maybe there's a tense moment for a while. Like, I don't know. I don't know what that looked like. But he was spared from it. So he was spared from it and he was delivered through the consequences. And I think a lot of times we just want to be exempt from all consequences of what we're asking, when actually what God wants to do is deliver us through them. Because what you see happen is after he is delivered, the impact of the king it has on the king. He's delivered through the consequences, and in Daniel 6, 24 through 28, you see King Darius actually proclaiming, saying, Daniel's God is the one true God. We need to worship him and follow him. So he was allowed to experience the consequences of the no, but through those consequences, God was glorified because the heart of a king was changed. And I think that's a huge thing for us to think through. We want great results when we draw a boundary line and communicate our boundary lines. It's not realistic. There will be friction. There will be times where you're told no, and there are times where you're called to righteous dissent. I'm also not saying that you run out waving a banner saying, righteous dissent. It's like, no, you just need to work this weekend. Like, there's no righteous dissent right now. But there's different things. So we need to make sure that's where community can come in and help and be like, quit being a jerk. But it's like how we can come together and what God is calling us to do. And take that step forward to have an impact for the kingdom of God on all those around us. So a couple of things to think about that I'd love for us to talk around our tables a little bit is, how have you seen the need for good communication kind of in your workplace around, like what are some examples that have happened, or where are some things you're like, yeah, people really struggled trying to express this part or something like that. Dig a little bit further. What sticks out to you from the examples of Esther and Daniel? So when you think about those, what are some things that come about? And why do we not often involve community into our communication? So what are some of the biggest roadblocks you have sometimes of bringing people in?